Louisiana, a land rich in history and resources. Originally the home of the Natchez, the Homer, and the Choctaw, but the adopted home of Iberville, Bienville, and Tonti. Louisiana, the focus of international struggle and intrigue for centuries. A place of mystique, the home of a people known for distinct culture and institutions, the parish and police jury. Louisiana, that catalyst for transforming the former British North American colonists into a national melting pot. Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, the refinement of blues and the gospel, the source of Creole and Cajun food, the home of Huey Long and Evangeline, Lee Armstrong and Marie Laveau. The Louisiana Purchase, arguably the world's most significant real estate transaction, will be the subject of this semester-long series, both on its immediate importance but its continuing impact today. Over the last 3 months, we've discussed the history of the Louisiana Purchase, emphasizing especially its origins, peoples, and strategic importance in the New World empires of the French, Spanish, and British. Several of our lecturers pointed out its uniqueness as well as its diversity and the very important impact it had on expanding and enriching the larger American culture and consciousness. This geographic entity, which today occupies the center of the continental United States at the time of its purchase, was at once the frontier of the older East Coast states, but also its gateway to Pacific expansion. Louisiana became the bridge between the East and the West, the old and the new, the nexus between the known and the unknown. Testifying to its historic importance was the subsequent development of 13 existing states in whole or part, ranging from the southern Canadian borders to the northern shores of the Gulf of Mexico. Louisiana first came into being as an extension of French Canada. New France, first established by Samuel de Champlain in 1604, had already expanded as far west as the Great Lakes area by the 6th decade of the 17th century. In their continual quest for new sources for forests, the French learned of the Great River, which seemingly flowed without ending. Frenchmen, including Marquette, Joliet, De La Salle, and Tonti, traveled down the Mississippi in search of the mouth of the river. Robert de La Salle especially hoped that this would be the inland waterway that would lead to the Pacific, thus shortening the trip to the Orient by at least 50%. Finally, he found a mouth flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, and on April 9, 1682, he formally claimed for his king, Louis XIV, with the assent of local Indians, all of the land drained by the Mississippi and its tributaries. In all, actually about 20 states came from the original Louisiana. La Salle appropriately named it La Louisiane, in honor of King Louis. Hence, Louisiana was called into being, but for the most of the French period, remained a concept rather than a well-defined territory. But Louisiana impinged on territory already claimed and settled by the Spanish. It also impinged territory at least claimed, if not actually settled, by the British to the east. For more than the next century and a half, England, France, and Spain vied for control of much of the same territory in North America. And by the end of the French and Indian War, the English emerged victorious. After the war, England expelled France almost completely from the continent and took a generous slice of Louisiana before France ceded the bulk of it to Spain, which also had lost Florida to England. While the Spanish increased the population and in general improved the quality of life, Louisiana remained essentially French, although an amalgamated French, resulting from the early interactions of French, Germans, Indians, and Africans who had come together at least culturally to produce a new creolized, that is, a local society, which reflected the infusion of African, Indian, and German words into the official French language. They also produced Creole food, such as gumbo and African stew, now enriched with an Indian spice, powdered dried sassafras leaves, which the French called filet, to which the French added various other ingredients. The Spanish brought with them their own legal traditions, similar to, but also different from the French version of the ancient civil law. One of Spain's new legal traditions was a quotation, the freedom purchase, which allowed slaves to purchase theirs or another's freedoms, even if the master did not wish to free an individual. This new policy helped to greatly increase the free black population, thus creating a third tier of inhabitants, whites, free blacks, and slaves. The Spanish also greatly increased the slave population, but ironically, bringing large numbers of slaves directly from the Senegambia region of Africa, the same source previously relied upon by the French. These new arrivals augmented the existing African community and reinforced African cultures which would remain viable in Louisiana much longer than in most of the other American societies. Spain greatly improved trade and began developing a system of overland trade. On the other hand, it barely increased the level of literacy among the masses, bequeathing a tradition of education neglect that would be inherited by Louisiana's new owners in the next century. Louisiana would be greatly affected by the revolutionary movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Spain would live to regret the support it gave the Americans in their struggle for independence from England. The Spanish unwittingly set in motion their own expulsion from the continent. Not only did an aggressive westward American expansion cost them most of their territory east of the Mississippi River, but by the beginning of the 19th century, soon their own colonies, such as Mexico and Venezuela, emulated the American example and declared their own independence from Spain. Spain was not only affected by the revolution of the Anglos and George Washington, but also France and Napoleon, and the revolution of Hayti and Louverture as well. Napoleon bullied Spain into returning Louisiana, but because of the success of the former Haitian colony in winning its independence from France, Napoleon was forced to sell Louisiana to the Americans, even though he had solemnly promised the Spanish king he would return it to Spain if he decided not to keep it. The Louisiana that France sold the Americans in 1803 was not the Louisiana de La Salle had claimed for Louis XIV in 1682. In fact, the United States had earlier received chunks of the original territory from Spain and would take even more from the Spanish in a little American-led revolution in West Florida in 1810. The Louisiana Napoleon sold the United States had vague boundaries, which Napoleon encouraged the Americans to, quote, make the most of it, end quote. Our geographer, Mary Johnson, explained how the acquisition of Louisiana provided the United States an opportunity to fill in the gaps of its minuscule knowledge of the interior of the continent after previously having developed a sketchy outline of North America's Atlantic and Pacific coast borders. Many pieces to this geographic puzzle could not be filled in until after the return of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which, while not completing the whole, provided the impetus for other contemporary and later explorers to augment information of this vast land. They too would confirm not only the vastness, but also the uniqueness and diversity of this new piece of real estate recently acquired but so long coveted by the United States. For more than a decade, Jefferson had dreamed of sending a small exploratory party across the Mississippi, Missouri, in search of that elusive inland waterway which would lead to the Pacific. He became more confident of his existence when in 1792, he learned that an American sea captain, Robert Gray, had found a large inland river which flows into the Pacific Ocean. Gray named it the Columbia River because a transcontinental voyage would necessarily trespass foreign-held territories. Jefferson, then the Secretary of State, proposed a private undertaking under the sponsorship of the American Philosophical Society. He received enthusiastic moral and financial support from some of the country's most distinguished citizens, including President George Washington, and surprisingly, his erstwhile political rival, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. But pressing personal, political, and diplomatic considerations postponed Jefferson's active involvement for a few years. Thus, it was not until he had assumed the presidency that he would again give it his active support. Jefferson's hand-picked lead explorer, his private secretary, Meriwether Lewis, was the best choice for the initial mission. The president had known and was well acquainted with the Lewis family even prior to Meriwether's birth. Jefferson had first broached the idea of an exploratory voyage across the continent to Lewis in 1792. 18-year-old Lewis had already traveled extensively throughout much of the Old South and the New West. With that typical brashness of youth, Lewis pronounced himself the ideal candidate to lead the expedition. But for the moment, Jefferson believed someone who had a broader education and general knowledge in geography, surveying, botany, and medicine would be better. However, during the intervening years, because Lewis had gained more travel experience as an officer in the United States military, and because he was a staunch Jeffersonian, Jefferson invited him to become his private secretary and to share his home at the executive mansion. For more than a year, Jefferson, who reputedly owned the best map collection of North America, tutored Lewis on geography and introduced him to the latest navigational instruments. Occasionally, Jefferson was joined by other learned men who schooled Lewis on North American birds, flora, and the various known Indian societies. The president had acquired enormous information on Indian life, including their taste and color, especially trade beads, food, drink, their superstitions, and religious beliefs. He repeatedly reminded Lewis to ever observe their personal manners and eccentricities, down to the slightest details. Jefferson cautioned Lewis to maintain copious notes in duplicate and triplicate. The president also sent him to Philadelphia to further his training under the tutelage of other renowned scholars, such as the eminent doctors George Logan and Benjamin Rush. It is no exaggeration to say that Lewis received a crash course in medicine, first aid, both preventive and curative, botany, and the preservation of both plant and animal specimens as well. To his credit, Lewis proved to be a quick and retentive learner. During the voyage, Lewis would apply his knowledge in folk medicine to cure dysentery, boils, scabs, remove ticks, treat snake bites, disinfect contaminated water, and set broken limbs. Although Jefferson had secured a modest $2,500 appropriation from Congress with his scientific research trip, essentially the president gave his protege a blank check. The president gave Lewis an official letter of introduction signed by himself. It directed all federal officials to cooperate and give Lewis every courtesy and consideration and to honor his request. Jefferson also encouraged private citizens to cooperate with Lewis, assuring them the government would reimburse any expenses. It must be noted that Jefferson's initial plans had been formulated long before the United States purchased Louisiana. Indeed, before the Congress had authorized the president to purchase New Orleans from France, provided the latter was willing to sell it. Originally, Jefferson planned for Lewis to lead a small group through Spanish-owned Upper Louisiana, hopefully without attracting and causing an official response from Spain. Because Jefferson had no real sense of the distance Lewis had to cover, he expected him to begin his trek during the late spring or early summer 1802 and return by the end of 1803. Delays in obtaining supplies, finding qualified recruits, but especially in obtaining the appropriate equipment, forced a postponement until the late summer of 1803. By that time, Lewis, along with his hand-picked co-leader, William Clark, son of the famed Revolutionary officer George Rogers Clark, were now ready to lead their party into the vast unknown. But before they departed, the country received the very exciting news that the United States had purchased not only New Orleans, but the entirety of Louisiana. News of the purchase was received in Washington on July 3rd, providing a grand opportunity for celebrating the nation's 27th birthday the next day. Jefferson received the news like a shocked but proud news father whose wife delivered triplets instead of a single child. He did not waste time passing out cigars, but hastened Lewis on. He had Lewis discuss the significance and the implication of this unexpected turn of events. Lewis would now set out to explore unknown, but now American land. Almost from the beginning of his departure, Lewis sent back reports to the president, that is, until he ventured too far from American settlements. One letter dated October 3, 1803, however, greatly alarmed Jefferson. Lewis informed the president of his intention, quote, to go up the Kansas River toward Santa Fe, end quote. Since Santa Fe was clearly Spanish territory, near Spain's gold and silver mines, the president knew the American expedition would invite more than a little opposition from Spain. Jefferson did not oppose Lewis' decision to postpone plans for getting up the Missouri River before the winter 1803. But he did not want him going south, so he instructed him, you must not undertake the winter excursion you propose. Instead, the president reminded him that the object of your mission is single, the direct water communication from sea to sea, formed by the bed of the Missouri and perhaps the Oregon. In other words, don't go south overland toward the west coast, but proceed northwest as much as possible by water in order to find that long sought-after inland waterway to the ocean. It is ironic that Lewis and his monumental trek across much of Louisiana never visited the one site that most identified this great land, New Orleans. In a later dispatch, in early 1804, President Jefferson informed Lewis that Lower Louisiana had been transferred to American control at New Orleans on December 20, 1803, and he should remain in the vicinity of St. Louis until Upper Louisiana was transferred in March of the following year. On March 9, 1804, Lewis witnessed the formal transfer of Louisiana from Spanish to French and then to American control. Lewis could now inform the Indians along the way that they had a new great white father who earnestly desired peace with them, and he would welcome a visit from them at his home in Washington. The last thing Lewis wanted was an Indian fight. He was prepared and under orders to do everything possible to avoid one. The best way to avoid a fight was to make sure one never got started. It would be more than 3 years before Jefferson saw Lewis again. During the interval, there would be false reports of his capture, even his death, and the failure of the mission. After more than a year and a half without word from Lewis, Jefferson sent a search party to try to find him. The Spanish, who had also learned about this troubling expedition, would also send 4 different search parties to find them, but not on a rescue mission, but to try to capture them and thus thwart their plans. The Lewis and Clark expedition has been much chronicled and heralded. In his marvelous work, Undaunted Courage, Stephen E. Ambrose revisits the expedition. But prior to writing the narrative in the late spring and summer of 1976, Ambrose led a party of his own family members and students on a reenactment of the journey, which now, because of modern transportation, took only several weeks instead of years to complete. But at one site, Ambrose observed, quote, "Except for a logging road, the place remained unchanged since Lewis was there," end quote. Around the campfire, they sang patriotic songs and indulged themselves in an outpouring of patriotism. It hardly takes much imagination to envision members of the Lewis and Clark team earlier singing patriotic songs or indulging in an outpouring of patriotism at their campsites. Perhaps as they paddled across fast-moving streams, or on a beautiful Indian summer night, gaping into a seemingly endless sky, they pounded the time and arrival of the very first New World inhabitants. What must this land have been like? Long before it was called Louisiana, even before it was generally known as America. Perhaps as Lewis and his party set up camp for the night, or returned from a successful hunt, or as they prepared to lie down before falling into deep sleep underneath the cover of distant clouds hanging from a big sky, they might have visualized the arrival of those first hunters and gatherers who entered the continent thousands of years ago. But how many thousands of years ago was it when these first newcomers first arrived? Specifically, how long ago had it been when the first humans entered the Mississippi River Valley? From which direction had they come? North, south, east, or west? While most scholars in the field, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians do not agree on an exact time, most agree that humans had become permanent residents of the New World by at least, if not earlier than, 10,000 to 15,000 BC. That they were similar to Old World residents is irrefutable. And although most of those people found by Old World settlers during the time of the Columbian expeditions appeared more Asian rather than African or European in physical appearance, we now know that at least a minority of New World inhabitants most probably came directly from both Africa and Europe, presumably, however, after the arrival of the first Asians. Based on their slow level of technological development by the 16th century, we can conclude the initial settlement of these transplanted Old World residents in the New World must have occurred before the invention of the wheel, the metal plow, and the metal hoe, because none of these important tools were found anywhere in the New World prior to their introduction by the Spanish. For several millennia, ancient Africans, Asians, and Europeans had made extensive use of the wheel, metal plows, and hoes, and in some instances, these were the most elementary of tools found in the expanding Old World societies. The wheel was adapted for use for both land and water travel, grinding seed into meals of flour, shaping pottery, and transforming the awesome power of water into energy via windmills. The wheel was adapted to create rudders for steering ships. Windmills helped to irrigate arid lands, which became easier for cultivation, especially with hard metal plows. Larger amounts of lands could now be farmed to produce enough surplus foods to store for use later or to sell or exchange for goods that could not be produced locally. The surplus food could be transported on the backs of domesticated draft animals or on wheeled vehicles pulled by draft animals. Thus, at the dawn of modern civilization in the Old World, large population centers had developed with well-defined divisions of labor and occupational specialties, and the total population could now be fed from the labor of only some of its members, freeing the rest to pursue other interests, such as stargazing, developing scientific formula, writing poetry, or composing songs, and inventing work tools. Ironically, the very ingredients which proved to be the keys to the onset of Old World advancement were curiously absent from the New World scene. These basic deficiencies, the lack of the wheel, the metal plow and hoe, along with the absence of draft animals, pushed back by thousands of years the beginning of the first technologically advanced New World civilizations. Because Native Americans could never grow enough food to feed large numbers of people in large quantities, certainly by Old World standards, their societies would at no time rival Babylon, Rome, Carthage, Athens, Alexandria, other Indian, Persian, or Asian cities in size and complexity. This lack of technological development was hindered by the absence of those traditional draft animals found in widespread use outside of the Americas. By some quirk of nature, nowhere in North, Central, South America could one find oxen, mules, horses, water buffaloes, or elephants, animals used to cultivate land in the Old World. We should caution, however, the slower rate of technological advancement does not suggest inferior mental or intellectual capacity of Amerindians. Indeed, some New World inhabitants, such as the Mayans, excelled in such fields as astronomy, medicine, and mathematics, far beyond that of any of their contemporaries in the Old World.
However, this lack of development left most of the New World continents, especially North America, sparsely populated, largely unexplored, but pristine and uncluttered, and thus an unexpected gift to newcomers from the Old World. Lures would encounter Indian tribes which belonged to the desert culture, a New World lifestyle that remained relatively unchanged for nearly 10,000 years. Prior to the expedition, Americans had scant knowledge of the West. As Europeans settled the eastern half of the continent, they learned only a little about the lands west of the eastern mountains. They heard tales about the existence of primitive peoples and animals. Jefferson had been told of the existence of so-called Welsh Indians, and he urged Lewis to bring back proof of their existence. Jefferson also believed there were ancient animals, now long extinct in the Old World, but reportedly still roaming in the western half of the North American continent. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson, an amateur naturalist, waited expectantly for Lewis to bring reports of sightings of mammoths, and perhaps even dinosaur bones or fossils. A later naturalist, more accurately, an ornithologist, John J. Audubon, a former resident of Saint Domingue, would catalog many species of birds found in Louisiana. Many of those Western Amerindians lived almost as primitively as Stone Age people had lived in the Old World. When the Lewis expedition encountered tribes west of the mountains, they were probably the first white men these Indians had ever seen. Not surprisingly, when they encountered people from most advanced societies, they were most impressed with goods such as brass buttons, metal knives, axes and scissors, and all too often non-metals such as alcohol and tobacco pipes. However, Lewis observed the most desired items of all were rifles, balls, and powder. Most of the Indians held guns on the plains, but cheap British shotguns. Lewis wanted to show the overall excellence of the American arms industry, but because of their bulk, he could not carry along free samples. He could demonstrate what his men could do with a Kentucky long rifle, but he could only promise not deliver similar weapons for the Indians. But Lewis insisted if the Indians remained peaceful, other traders would soon deliver a wide variety of trade goods to them. Jefferson had stressed to Lewis that he must assure the Indians the Americans sought commerce, not their land. They could expect calico shirts, ivory combs, bright mirrors, brass kettles, beads, and tomahawks. And the chiefs would be presented with medals bearing the likeness of President Jefferson, their great white father. Above all, the Americans must remember that they represented a nation
and needed to make a favorable impression.
Members of the Lewis and Clark expedition were a diverse and motley group. While most of them were white men, there was also a black man, York, a slave who belonged to Captain William Clark. To those Indians who had never seen neither white men nor black men, York was always a curiosity. One Indian chief, suspicious of his dark-colored skin, tried to rub off the black paint. Throughout the trip, there were a number of Indians who served as guides and translators for at least a part of the trip. None, however, would become more celebrated than Sacagawea, a 15-year-old Indian girl who was 6 months pregnant when she signed on as a translator. Sacagawea had been captured and sold into slavery from her homeland across the mountains. She had been purchased by and was accompanied by her French-Canadian husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, a foreign trader. Her knowledge of languages of the interior tribes would make her an invaluable source. The party encountered an occasional mixed-race French-speaking Indian, a lone British foreign trader who provided helpful advice. Over the course of more than 2 years, this mixed-race group learned to function as a group, practically as equals, cognizant that the success of the whole depended upon each member. On one occasion, November 26, 1805, Captains Lewis and Clark debated whether they should make camp for the winter. Invariably, they decided to involve the whole group in the decision, giving each member a vote. Professor Ambrose noted, quote, "This was the first vote ever held in the Pacific Northwest. It was the first time in American history that a black slave had voted, the first time a woman had voted," end quote. Actually, it was probably the first time an Indian woman had voted on an equal basis with men, because for a period of about 12 years, white women landowners had voted in New Jersey, but in 1806, they lost the vote because some men complained that their votes had often been the decisive ones. On occasion, however, Lewis found it necessary to court-martial recapture deserters or other offenders. The usual punishment was to force a convicted offender to run the gauntlet. Once, a Private Moses B. Reed was forced to run the gauntlet 4 times through the party. Each man had 9 switches, so Reed received about 500 lashes, well laid on. At different times, the expedition experienced feasts of famine. At one point, Lewis reported catching nearly 500 large catfish, some which he traded with local natives. Another time, he reported sighting more than 500 buffaloes. That night, he and his men dined for the first time on buffalo hump, buffalo tongue, and buffalo steaks. Ambrose informs us, quote, "Next to the tail of the beaver, buffalo hump and tongue at once became the meat of choice," end quote. There were other occasions, however, when their food was so scarce, they were forced to trade some of their valuable items for food. On one occasion, Private John Shields, the blacksmith, fashioned and repaired axes and hoes for local Indians who exchanged corn for these implements. Next to firearms, which Lewis refused to sell, the most popular item the blacksmith could provide the Indians was battle axes. In one village, each metal item was exchanged for 7 to 8 gallons of corn.
As they pushed farther into the interior, the explorers marveled at the wide variety of animals. They saw large flocks of pelicans. After Lewis shot one, he was astonished to find the pouch could hold 5 gallons of water. They caught sight of the coyote, which Lewis called a prairie wolf. They were perhaps the first Americans to see a coyote. Lewis and his party also lamented the continual presence of ticks, gnats, and mosquitoes. He described the insects as a plague, so thick that the men could not keep them out of their eyes, noses, ears, and throats. The only effective remedy was voyagers' grease, which they applied a thick coat over their exposed limbs, necks, and face. Throughout the trip, the explorers made astrological calculations of their position by observing the celestial bodies. As they pushed farther west, they crossed spectacular waterfalls, sloshed through swamps rich in beaver and other far-bearing animals. They sighted for the first time large grizzly bears, which Lewis described as a much more furious and formidable animal than the black bear of the eastern states. On occasion, they were mesmerized by the other beauty and fertility of some land. Other times, they were awestruck by the barren beauty of some deserts. On more than one occasion, their boats were overturned by the violent currents of the rapids, threatening to deluge the vessels and its contents, both human and archival. Lewis once noted in his diary how Sacagawea had calmly collected and recovered most of the light articles which had blown overboard.
The men complained ultimately about wind-driven sand in the spring and summer, and wind-driven snow in the fall and winter. Much of the time, they were plagued by malaria, dysentery, rheumatism, diarrhea, and even though Lewis scarcely mentioned it, venereal diseases, most probably syphilis. Lewis did most of the doctrine, but after exhausting most of his medicine, he was forced to rely on local plants and herbs, acting similarly to his mother, who had often used these remedies in Virginia. Occasionally, Sacagawea suggested a particular plan. One time, Lewis himself, another time Sacagawea, became ill and had to be nursed back to health by Clark or another member of the party. Most of the Native Americans they encountered were, if not friendly and hospitable, were at least interested in trade. On several occasions, however, they encountered those whose goodwill they could not win, nor whose courage and hostility they could not overwhelm. Such was their experience with the proud Sioux of the Dakotas. This long enmity between the Sioux and Americans would be long-lasting. Many years later, they had two great leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, with humble Custer's pride. But not too long afterwards, these two great warriors would themselves be defeated and lead their people into American captivity. Upon his return to the East, Lewis proposed an embargo on the Sioux. He insisted the government should forbid the Sioux from trading at their trading posts. He observed, quote, "No punishment could assume a more terrific shape to them than that of withholding every description of merchandise from them," end quote.
By the end of May 1805, they sighted the Rocky Mountains for the first time. Very probably, they were the first white Americans to see them, but they learned they had to find a path through the mountains. The farther west they went, they encountered countless numbers of buffaloes, and, next to the Indians, the buffalo's chief predator, wolves, were much smaller than their eastern relatives. They soon entered the river. Lewis would probably call the Salmon. It was at that time Lewis believed that he was near the Pacific. They learned through friendly Indians that there were no buffaloes west of the mountains, but the transmountainous, mainly the Nez Perce, lived largely on salmon. Lewis also learned that a tribe which lived west of the mountains often came east to hunt buffaloes, and concluded if Indian women and children could go back and forth through the pass, certainly their party could get through. During the winter 1805-6, as the buffalo disappeared, they were forced to find another source of meat: dried fish purchased from local Indians, and sometimes dogs. Lewis reported, "The men were extremely fond of dog meat, and for my part, I prefer it vastly to lean venison or elk." And so they began, sometimes by water, other times overland, slowly carrying their heavy baggage through the mountain pass. As they celebrated the 4th of July, 1805, they became the first Americans to ever enter Montana and get to see the Yellowstone, the Milk, and the Great Falls. They gave the rivers various names, mostly after themselves, the men and even Sacagawea. On August 12, 1805, Lewis and his party became the first Americans to look on Idaho. That same day, he recorded for the first time, "I tasted the water of the Great Columbia River." He would soon exit Louisiana as he ventured into the western side of the Continental Divide as they headed for the Pacific Ocean. Throughout the fall and winter 1805 to 1806, Lewis mapped out the routes they traversed. He described birds, plants, and animals. When at the end of 1805, and they had finally reached the Pacific coast, they encountered Spanish and British traders, the latter employees of the Hudson Bay Company. Both countries claimed this land as their own. Often Lewis found the weather to be depressing and damp, but noted its potential for trading. They basically completed their mission during that winter season.
Ambrose suggests by February 11, 1806, they had finished their work, an invaluable contribution to the world's knowledge. Together with his previous maps of the lower Missouri, Lewis brought the American West together for the first time. Thus, after more than 2 years of exhausted travel, the Clark and Lewis party had found the most practical and navigable passage across the continent of North America. While the best route was a good route, it fell short of Jefferson's hope. It was not the imagined passage of Jefferson and so many before him, because there were no all-water route across the continent. If there ever would be a shorter route to the Orient, it would have to wait the coming of the Panama Canal more than a century later. Lewis fixed March 20, 1806 as a departure date for their return to the East, largely retracing their voyage of the past 2 years. Earlier, Lewis had managed to send a few sketchy messages to the president by the occasional foreign trader he had met along the initial voyage, and the ever-anxious president reported such to Lewis's relatives in early 1805. Thereafter, the messages were few and far between, and then they stopped. Thereafter, the only information about the explorers were rumors from foreign traders in and out of St. Louis. Not surprisingly, however, the return trip took less time than the initial one, but they lost several days' journey when they encountered a sudden and unexpected snowstorm in the Rockies in mid-June. The captains decided to divide the party in order to maximize their observations on the return. Lewis would lead one group, Clark another, and then they would rendezvous at the mouth of the Yellowstone. They encountered minor difficulty with some of the Indians they had earlier met, probably because they had run out of trading goods. They had nevertheless convinced one Indian leader, Big White, to accompany them to see the president. Clark arrived at the designated site a week earlier than Lewis, but left explaining that food was scarce, but mosquitoes were plentiful. Therefore, he was going on, and they would meet up farther downstream. The two groups finally reunited on August 12, 1806, exactly 1 year after they had first sighted Idaho. They encountered two American fur traders who had also explored large areas of the purchased territory, but who were looking for furs. They had begun their trip in August 1804 in search of the Yellowstone, looking for beaver. Thus, Ambrose writes, quote, "The Lewis and Clark expedition had been only 3 months ahead of private trappers exploring the Louisiana Purchase," end quote. They learned that this official exploration was not the only one, merely the first.
After 28 months, the deed was done. The party returned to St. Louis in late September, and Lewis sent a preliminary report to the president, who he promised to see as soon as possible. The president was informed that no all-water passage existed, but a passage partly overland through mountains and partly by water did exist. Louisiana was a great country with unlimited potential. It afforded immense opportunity for foreign trading. While the British occupied a small portion of the territory beyond Louisiana, Lewis believed the British would eventually be cut off. Lewis also had to inform the president he had found many different groups of Indians, but no Welsh Indians. The president received Lewis' letter with great joy on October 24th. He suggested that Lewis meet him at Monticello before going to Washington. Nearly 2 months later, after being received, wined and dined along the way, and after a brief visit with his mother, Jefferson and Lewis embraced for the first time since July 1803. The president urged Lewis to write an official report on his trip, not knowing that Lewis and Clark, as well as other party members, had already begun negotiating to publish accounts of their trip. Over the next few years, Jefferson continually prodded Lewis, but he never completed it, although his diary would be published later.
After his return east, Lewis became a celebrity and was caught up in the adulation of public and private circles. He intrigued with others to secure financial reward from his efforts, but his personal life began to unravel as he suffered from what was most probably depression. Although Jefferson appointed him as governor of Upper Louisiana and later superintendent of Indian Affairs, Lewis was as big a disappointment as a civil administrator as he had been successful in commanding the expedition. For the rest of his life, he remained in debt, although he borrowed frequently. He never repaid the government for the advances he received, and he never completed his report. Finally, in 1809, overwhelmed by his own personal demons, Meriwether Lewis very probably took his own life near Memphis, Tennessee. Jefferson and the country mourned the loss of one of his greatest heroes. What of the other members of the party? Jefferson nominated, but the Senate rejected Clark's appointment to the permanent rank of captain in the Army. He later completed detailed maps of the Louisiana Territory and became a land speculator in the new territory. Most surviving members of the exploration party received a cash settlement and a land warrant. Most, but not all. Neither the lone black man nor the lone red woman would receive the nation's thanks or rewards. Sacagawea received nothing for her considerable help, although her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, received $500 and 300 acres of land. Sacagawea died in 1812 at the age of 25. Captain Clark adopted her 2 children, Baptiste, who was born during the voyage, and her infant daughter, Lisette. Neither did Clark's slave York receive a reward for his efforts, although his master, Captain Clark, received reimbursements for rations provided his slave. The comradeship the slave and the master had enjoyed, indeed often endured, ended in bitterness when the voyage was over. York was returned to slavery, a condition he now found unbearable. Clark, insensitive to his feelings, wrote Lewis that York had requested, indeed had insisted on his freedom as a reward for his services, something his master completely opposed. Failing emancipation, York requested he be sent to Louisville to join his wife who had been sold there. Clark agreed reluctantly, but only for a visit. When forced to return, Clark noted that York had become insolent and sulky, but after he had given him a severe beating, he was much mended. For York, Louisiana had not meant freedom, but a renewed slavery even worse than the one he had left. Finally, shortly after the War of 1812, he was freed. Unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter.
York would not suffer alone. The Louisiana Purchase would attract thousands of slave owners to the new territory. These thousands brought with them tens of thousands of slaves, ripped apart from family members to live and die many miles from the places of their birth. Louisiana would give a new lease of life to the peculiar institution that Jefferson had once predicted would die out within a generation or two. It would become the source of sectional dispute over the next 6 decades, requiring one compromise after the other, first in Missouri, later in Kansas and Nebraska, and finally, when the nation's leaders could not compromise again, it was one of the factors leading to the Civil War. But before the war came, Louisiana and the other states carved out of the Purchase produced untold riches, though often on the backs and at the suffering of others. The largely English-speaking Americans who came to Louisiana, especially New Orleans, found not only a diverse polyglot, but also a more tolerant society. While it did not promote racial, gender, or class equality, it tolerated differences. It may have been class structured, but it also embraced difference because it had learned from and benefited from diversity. At first, the Americans would be stunned by it, but they too eventually embraced it and would help to create a new culture, which would include, not exclude. But before too long, diversity was surrendered in the name of sameness, that is, Americanization. The Purchase territory became a refuge and a land of second chance, where former nobodies became somebodies, provided they were white nobodies. It became the new home for many Indians from eastern states, like Georgia, as they became victims of the Indian removal policy of the state and national governments. Many perished on the Trail of Tears as they were forced out of the ancestral lands their ancestors had inhabited for centuries. But what is the significance of Louisiana Purchase for us today? Can you imagine the United States bereft of Louisiana? The United States would not only be poor in territory, it would indeed be poor in commerce, culture, and national identity. From New Orleans to Minneapolis, from St. Louis to Helena, Montana, the economy of the country still depends on the corn, wheat, meats, and other grains and cereals produced in the country's breadbasket. Natural resources and petroleum, natural gas, and coal from Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Wyoming help to fuel the nation's economy. But the Purchase still resonates throughout the nation's culture. All up and down the mighty Mississippi, from New Orleans to Memphis, St. Louis, and St. Paul, one can still dance the music that originated in the Mississippi River Valley, the great heartland of the Purchase territory. With its long history of music as a way of living, could ragtime, the blues, and jazz have originated anywhere else? Its romantic scenery has become the setting for numerous plays, musicals, and movies. The musical tradition blends with the culinary tradition that Louisiana exported to the rest of the nation. Gumbo, once a local delight, can be found throughout the country, indeed, much of the world. Cajun dishes, once limited to isolated towns and villages of South Louisiana, are now the must cuisine and the best dining establishments around the country. Imagine if you can, however, the reincarnation of some of the principles of the Purchase and its subsequent exploration. What would they talk about? Jefferson would certainly be pleased to know that this paradise more than fulfilled his expectation about tying the country together. Take a trip up or down the Mississippi River Valley via Interstate 55-57 from Louisiana to Wisconsin or Minnesota. One can still experience the vastness as well as the beauty and uniqueness of this territory. Lewis and Clark would marvel at the continuing attraction of the Yellow Song, now partly preserved as a national treasure, the Big Sky country about which they wax eloquently, is still a favorite tourist attraction.
But we must admit, Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark had a very limited view of the potential in future Louisiana. It was a land flowing with milk and honey if you were a white male, particularly if you owned property. They only saw it from their own eyes, the way things were at that time, not the way things could be. They never had a vision of what the Louisiana Territory could have been, indeed should have been, for all of the inhabitants, black, red, white, male and female. Lewis had seen, had written about, and Jefferson had marveled at his report of the grandeur of the Rockies, the serenity of open skies of Idaho and Montana, and the beauty of the Yellowstone. He had described in great details a pristine wilderness with endless trees and the vast swamplands, teeming with beaver and great prairies covered with buffaloes, deer, and elks. But Lewis and Clark had not seen, perhaps because they were not looking for it, Louisiana's greatest assets, people. He had met, sometime befriended, or was befriended by Shoshone, Nez Perce, and Kansas Indians, but he never considered them his equal. Some were worthy of the beneficence of the Americans, others were not. Lewis and his colleagues saw Indians who might be Americanized, civilized, and Christianized, but not fellow humankind with their own unique values, cultures, and tradition that need not be changed, but incorporated into the larger society to enrich the whole. But perhaps those who would have had the most to rejoice about would be York and Sacagawea. York died not long after escaping slavery, but now he would find that his children, his children's children have achieved a degree of freedom and level of advancement, though not complete, that neither he nor his contemporaries could have imagined. Sacagawea would learn that members of both her gender and race have scored impressive, if uneven, progress. Probably better than any of the white men who completed the voyage, they saw the contradictions. Imagine a conversation between York and Sacagawea today. They said we couldn't do it, but we did. They couldn't conceive of the freedom of all of the inhabitants of this continent, but we did. It never happened in our own lifetime, but it did. Imagine this same land bereft of slavery. York would probably be amazed to find African-American mayors in New Orleans, Memphis, Little Rock, and even in Minneapolis. Sacagawea would find that a number of American Indians now serve in Congress or in the United States Senate. Today, women serve at the highest levels of government, state, local, and national, both in the military and civilian sectors.
But finally, what should the Louisiana Purchase mean for us today? It should serve as a continuous symbol of a dream that became a reality. It should remind us that the Purchase was much more than the individual lands, trees, mountains, buffaloes, coyotes, and grizzly bears, but taken as a whole, they represented a greater America. The bicentennial celebration let us stop and reflect. We are Louisiana. The landscape, rivers, mountains, and valleys would be the same if known by different names. The resources found therein should serve us rather than we serve them. We preserve and conserve them as a legacy of our past, but also a gift we bequeath to future generations.
The dream can best be likened to gumbo, the cuisine that best identified Louisiana to the larger American society. Gumbo is a combination of many different ingredients combined together in the same dish, but each ingredient retains its uniqueness and individuality. Therein comes a pluribus unum, our oneness out of many. For me, and hopefully for each of you, the Louisiana Purchase resonates as a dream not yet fulfilled, but pregnant with potential. And so it should be, an evolving dream, better today than yesterday, but not as good as it can become tomorrow.